Next question. Ben Hindermarsh says, what do you remember from the night when Stone Cold Steve Austin walked out on the WWE just before Raw was about to start back in 2002? And what was the locker room reaction to when that happened?
Well, I mean, everybody knew to an extent, not the details of why, not the details of when he walked out during that day, but Steve's not here. And Steve was nowhere to speak, and that was such an anomaly for any show at that time because Steve was everywhere. So it was obviously like what happened, but you didn't outwardly publicly ask questions or try to dig in. You just like, well, maybe it'll be back next week. Obviously he's still a huge draw, if not still the biggest draw in the business. We need him. But at the same time, everybody's just nobody was rumbling and what do you think's going on? Because anytime you start to get those questions, like I talked about with the Lombardi Whippleman thing, when they start probing questions and then you say, oh, well, that's really a crappy way to do business. Ooh, got to go back and tell Steve what Stevie said. So everybody was kind of very heavy atmosphere. And I think it was the Georgia, the Georgia Dome or whatever. It was Atlanta, Georgia, where he walked out, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah,
I'll look that up.
Yeah, but
it sounds about right.
But at the same time, no, everybody's worried about themselves, and you got to think at this time too. There's no place to go. We're still puckered up a little bit and a little tight because WCW's out of business. There's nowhere to go. TNA is about to start up maybe 2002, 2003, but it's not a viable place to work to make a living. So everybody just kind of kept it to themselves.
You know that Steve Austin, this wasn't the first time he walked out on WWE that year.
Really?
He'd actually walked out following WrestleMania 18 because he was unhappy with wrestling Scott Hall at WrestleMania 18 because I don't think he'd come out and say it, but basically he just thought it was beneath him. And he was basically squashing Scott. I mean, maybe not squashing, but he was winning basically. And
it was not a place for Steve Austin to be at WrestleMania. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he walked out following creative disagreements for several weeks. He returned back in April. And then he left. He was about, 2 months back on Raw. And then he left again after not wanting to lose to Brock Lesnar in an unadvertised... I mean, it was advertised, but it was advertised that day.
And it was just, no, I don't understand why unless because of that WrestleMania 18 thing, they were testing Steve, which is incredibly crazy to say, even out loud, but it makes a little bit of sense that you put up a stink and kind of walked out after WrestleMania 18. You come back for a couple months. Now we need you with no storyline, no angle, no blood feud, no build-up. Want to wrestle Brock on free TV and put him over clean.
And he'd only been there for like a month, Brock.
Yeah, there's something more to that where that feels like a test. I could be off base, but the timing of what you just told me, it's too much in line with that. Do you sort of get that impression?
Yeah, definitely. I think Steve Austin himself would say he was not great at dealing with bad creative. And we talked a week or two ago.
He shouldn't be. Why should anybody put up with bad creative?
But the thing is, he would never offer solutions. He wouldn't, but he doesn't need to. He's Steve Austin. You kowtow to him rather than, him trying to ingratiate himself to the writing team or whatever. But he just wouldn't have it. Oh. And I think that's absolutely right. But there's also the thing, there's other things. There's a conspiracy as well I want to bring up to you that I've never mentioned before. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention before in a minute. But immediately hearing this, we'll talk about the day of. Immediately hearing, well, Steve Austin's not here, and you just go, well, he'll be here in a couple of weeks. And then he just keeps not showing up. And then I'm sure you heard, Vince McMahon go out there and lambast Steve Austin. And I know what I wanted to ask you just before, because we mentioned a week or two ago just how bad the creative was in 2002. Steve wouldn't put up with it, and he left.
Yeah.
And you're saying he was right to.
Well, here's the thing. I'm going to give you, and this is from knowing Vince Russo for decades now and doing the show with Vince.
And he was there around this time, wasn't he?
No,
or was it?
No, he was not there. He was
No. He was there for like a week or two.
He was there consulting in Stanford, and then he said that Stephanie talked to him like a child, like he never wrote a TV show before. And then Vince came to him and said, "This isn't going to work, pal." And he goes, "I know it's not going to work. I'm gone." And that was it. Stephanie sat him down like he was a brand new intern and talked to him that way. So that's straight from Russo. This is also straight from Russo. When Russo would, because he would always say about the shows now, if I gave Steve Austin this promo, this script, this finish, or this whatever I want him to do, and he did not, he would say no, or he would tear it up in front of me. Now, he never needed to tear up a script in front of Vince or at Vince, because Vince Russo would sit down with Steve and say, "This is what I'm thinking." Steve will give his input on his character, and then that's what you would see on TV. The writing team at this point is, here it is, we're the boss. And in the way it was presented was, this is the idea. There's no room for movement. It's say the words, do all this, where Russo would give just the bullet point. Get across this. You have this match. Vince would also be great at this. And I know this for a fact, even in TNA. Before I go out there, before my music hits, same thing with Steve, Vince would grab you and go, "Remember, this is what happened 2 weeks ago. This is what happened this week. React accordingly, or we're going to B-roll all this." He would remind you where you're at in the storyline, what your character's doing, what that person in the ring done to you, and you would react accordingly. They don't allow that anymore. There's no collaboration in this. It's like Killer Cross right now is so over. He's got the top t-shirt selling, and they're almost going to say, "Oh, you think he's great? What about this?" And if Cross says, "Well, my character wouldn't do that," well, your character's not doing anything then. Steve was right. Steve was right in a way to walk out. He claims, from what I've read and listened to, probably wasn't the best way to do things. Like you said, he never handled bad creative very well. But should anybody that cares about their brand, their character, and their whole overall business, should you tolerate bad creative with the greatest roster in the history of wrestling at the time? That kills me, though. Well, don't get on the writers or the bookers or Vince for writing crappy stuff. In other words, you're released because creative has nothing for you. Fire the damn writer then.
Austin was saying this on WW, I guess, F show, either E or F, it was around that time, on Bite This, the internet show they were doing at the time, which I love Bite This as well. It's a shame that went, or the original one, Dr. Tom and Draws and that kind of thing. I love Bite This. And he would talk. He called in and just said how much everything sucked and why it sucked. And that the WWF at the time was going through creative malaise. We already knew where his head was at, and then after he leaves, he has personal issues that we won't go into as well, that, he was having a meltdown personally, quite frankly, over this as well. What did you think of the propaganda machine of the WWE going into overdrive with the Confidential? If you remember WWE Confidential, that sort of behind-the-scenes magazine show that was really good for the first year, or first 6 months at least, where Vince McMahon and Jim Ross are going hell for leather on trying to get the fans on the promotion side rather than Austin's.
Yeah, this was about as tone deaf as Brett Screwed Brett.
Yeah.
It was not.
With the t-shirt that says "why" instead of "what." Do you remember that?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But didn't Vince cut the promo kind of like Austin took his ball and went home type thing? Or was that the exact terminology?
Exactly. I think.
You know what Austin took? He took his integrity. He took his ethics according to his id, his character, because he knew when you're doing this and it doesn't make sense and it's not present. Steve Austin versus Brock Lesnar, WrestleMania level match, and you're putting it on a Raw that you promoted the match that day. And he's
it wasn't even important. It wasn't even going to be the main event, I don't think. That was a King of the Ring qualifying match.
What are we doing here?
Mm-hmm. Why is even Steve Austin in the King of the Ring tournament? He's Steve Austin.
And why is he not white? Why is he not going through everybody like he did with the famous Austin 316 promo, which was King of the Ring? If you can't book your way out of that match and you're like, well, somebody's going to get hurt by this, don't book the match. Or at least start the storyline. Yeah, WWE, by pulling the trigger so early and having hairline trigger, or not so secretly, at least what I'm looking at with the timeline, trying to test Steve Austin, their biggest draw ever. Will he do the job? Will he do the favor? Will he do good business? Will he do the tradition like Vince said in the Brett screwed Brett thing? There's a time-honored tradition here. There's a time-honored tradition to take the guy that sells more T-shirts, pay-per-views, tickets, and anybody in the history up to this point to maybe take care of his character.
Cost himself a bit of money in the end. Did you know that Vince McMahon fined him?
How much?
$650,000, which Austin managed to negotiate down to $250,000 in the end, which he did pay. So, I mean, I guess in that sense, yes, maybe he should be fine to stop that.
I think Steve made it back.
Yeah, probably because he was getting $10 million royalty checks a year in the late 90s. He could probably afford it.
And he deserved,
and you don't pay tax on fines.
He deserved every penny. I still think if you tell me he got $10 million in royalties, you know the way wrestling promoters work, you probably owed him 15 or 20.
I've got a theory for you. I don't even know if it's a theory, but like Austin was saying, he was drinking too much, he was burned out. You could tell even in his physique, he was putting on weight and not looking after himself as well as he had done in maybe 98, I guess. A few years have passed. But here's the thing. He comes back in, February of 2003. Beforehand, he was wrestling a full-time schedule, basically, Steve Austin, in that 2 months between April and June, let's say. Or if not, he was wrestling frequently. And then he comes back and he does 2 matches. One of them is the Eric Bischoff match. And then the second one, the first one, by the way, was the No Way Out, I think, 2003.
Was that the dumpster one where he threw him in the dumpster?
No, that was the Redneck Triathlon later in the year. That would have been Bad Blood, I think. And
wait a minute, Redneck Triathlon?
The Redneck Triathlon.
I love it.
Yeah, it was with Steve Austin. And that wasn't a match, by the way, either. And so, yeah, Steve wrestles twice. Once against Eric Bischoff, where he just beats up Eric Bischoff. He may have had one on Raw, which was a nothing match. And then he wrestles The Rock at WrestleMania 19. And then, bam, all of a sudden, his neck is so bad he cannot wrestle ever again. And I'm wondering, I mean, I'm sure the x-rays are there, and I'm sure I'm just way off base, but how come his neck was fine in June of 2002 and then not wrestling at all in that 9 months or 8 months? Why was his neck then career-ending 8 months later?
Well,
I've always found that a bit of a weird disconnect.
But the origin of that neck injury is really, really serious. The Owen Hart tombstone. It's not something that just heals completely and goes away. And also medical technology. There wasn't even that surgery that Kurt got to just kind of put the Band-Aid on the neck, or the surgery I had in 97. That surgery is pretty invasive and takes anywhere from 6 months to a year to really come back. Maybe, like we said about Cena for WrestleMania last year, too much wrestling or too little wrestling. In other words, Steve's schedule wasn't as full time, so maybe the bumps were hurting extra, and from the time off, the neck was really taking a lot of abuse, and he wasn't sure like what's going on with that. It just literally, we talked about it a few times. I feel great. I could get in the ring, but we don't know what kind of bump's going to have, what the ring's going to be like, what the bump's going to be like, and what that bump is going to do. It could be the last bump you ever take or last step you ever take. So he could have been hitting that wall. And I'm not sure if he had surgery sometime after that, between that and obviously returning. Because after that, February 2003, the very next year was WrestleMania 20. That's when he reffed the Lesnar-Goldberg match, and he was more coming out as a special attraction. He didn't feel like a full-time wrestler, right?
He wasn't a full-time wrestler. He retired after WrestleMania 19, and then he was the GM or the co-GM for a year, or until like Survivor Series, I guess. No, yeah, for Survivor Series. So he was only the co-GM for 6 months. Then he did the special guest referee thing for Goldberg and Brock Lesnar. And then I don't think you saw Steve Austin for ages, and then for some reason he fell out with Vince. And then at the same time, around Austin falling out with Vince, The Rock had his contract cut, and no one even called him to let him know that his WWE contract was running up. The Rock, of all people.
Nobody's immune to this, as you could tell. We're talking about Austin and Rock, two of the biggest names ever.
Yeah, but how dare you do too well, Rock, with your Hollywood career? This'll show you.
Yeah, pretty much. Do good, but don't do too good.
Yeah, when I say conspiracy theory, it's not a conspiracy theory that he was pretending to have a worse neck injury than he was. Maybe that is what I was getting at. But I always thought that the timing of it was very odd that he had I've just looked at his match listings, full-time schedule. He was on all the house shows up until the Brock Lesnar thing. Then he disappears for 8 months or so. And then all of a sudden his neck injury, when he was working full-time, all of a sudden his neck injury is now career ending. And I always found that weird. That you could go from, wrestling 4 times a week to I am done.
Has Steve ever addressed that as far as that time frame, what was going on?
Well, I mean, he obviously had the heart issue, which was...
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Basically.
A heart issue?
Yeah, going into WrestleMania 19. You were there.
Oh, I do remember some touch and go stuff before that match they weren't sure about. He was not feeling well. That's all I knew. He was not feeling well. And I know they had a documentary where they I didn't watch it, but they explored it a little bit deeper. But I remember at the show, they were like, Steve's not feeling well at all. And you could tell I thought he had the flu or something that was like sapping his energy away. I didn't know it was a heart issue.
No, he thought it was a heart issue. He loaded up on caffeine beforehand, and he ended up having like a panic attack or an anxiety attack the night before. Ended up in the hospital. Then they said, no, your heart's fine, but partly due to stress, partly due to, intake of too much caffeine or energy drinks and whatever else he was having. He just sent his system haywire. And, it's a lot of pressure to put yourself on. But he already knew that was going to be his last match. Yeah, he'd have one nearly 20 years after with Kevin Owens. But he knew going into that match at WrestleMania 19 that would be his last match because his neck was already screwed up. But my question always was, well, what happened in between June of 2002 and February of 2003, where you went from wrestling full-time to this is it?
Well,
with no wrestling in between.
It's like I said before, we can't predict when the bump cart gets punched completely. And your hope is that you get it earlier rather than later. And he might have felt that. You got to think about the pressure that guy was under since he carried the company on his back from losing the WCW and not being profitable to being immensely profitable and popular. And then it was almost like we have some new toys. So your old toy, you're going to have to put over the new toy with no angle story. And then his neck, you're talking about from the time of the Owen Hart injury to the time you're talking about, it's years. It's thousands of matches. It's tons of flights, hotel rooms, uncomfortable accommodations, even being a top guy. You still got to be, even if it's a private plane, you're still stuck in a fuselage for hours and you're still renting a car to drive somewhere. You're still not in your own bed, not eating your own food, not in your routine. So I don't doubt Steve was never the type of guy, even though he walked out on the company. But what he did was he walked out because of bad creative. I think that's the better terminology. When you say walked out on the company, he abandoned the company. But I dare say creative abandoned the Stone Cold Steve Austin character and was willing to flush him down the toilet for the new toy, which worked out. But 1 month of the new toy, we're ready to throw everything this dude gave to us away. So maybe it's a little bit of mental, like, I'm hurting. I know I'm near the end. Why should I push my luck and go beyond the end and maybe never walk again? So now, Steve didn't. Let's rethink the phrase. Creative abandoned Steve Austin. Steve Austin didn't abandon WWE.